June 3, 1945. 4:47 in the morning. The light came slowly to the Red River Valley, seeping across the flat Minnesota prairie like watercolor bleeding into paper. In the pre-dawn gray, the sugar beet fields of Clay County stretched endlessly in all directions, geometric rows of green interrupted only by the occasional farmhouse, stark white against the dark soil. At the edge of one such field, near the town of Moorhead, Minnesota, a man knelt in the dirt. His hands were calloused, his back bent from years of farm work, but his face was wrong for this landscape. Hiroshi Tanaka was 27 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, with black hair cut military short and eyes that held the particular exhaustion of men who'd been at war for too long. He wore denim overalls, 2 sizes too large, and a faded blue work shirt. American clothes on a Japanese body. Prisoner of war insignia stitched crudely on the back. The morning was cool enough that he could see his breath. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster called. Closer, the sound of other men stirring. 43 Japanese prisoners, waking in the converted barn that served as their temporary housing during the harvest season. Hiroshi had been awake for an hour already, unable to sleep, sitting at the edge of this field and trying to reconcile 2 impossible truths. He was a prisoner in enemy territory, and yesterday, the farmer's daughter had smiled at him. Act 2. The Prisoner. Hiroshi Tanaka had never intended to be a farmer. Born in 1918 in Osaka, he'd been the second son of a textile merchant, a family of modest means but reasonable prospects. He'd attended technical school, learned basic engineering, dreamed of working on bridges or buildings in Japan's rapidly modernizing cities. He liked mathematics, precision, the satisfaction of solving problems with clean solutions. He'd also been drafted in 1941 at age 23, sent to the Pacific as part of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Construction Corps. Not a combat soldier, an engineer tasked with building airstrips, bunkers, defensive positions on islands most people had never heard of. He'd spent 3 years moving from island to island, always building, always preparing for battles that seemed increasingly hopeless. He'd been captured on Saipan in July 1944. Not in glorious combat, in the chaos of the American invasion, separated from his unit, wounded in the leg by shrapnel, found by 2 Marine Corps infantrymen who'd been more interested in taking prisoners than shooting a man who couldn't run. They'd given him water. That had surprised him more than anything. He'd been taught that Americans were barbarians who took no prisoners. Instead, they'd bandaged his leg and walked him to a collection point where dozens of other Japanese soldiers sat, dazed and ashamed, trying to process the fact that they were still alive. The shame had been overwhelming. In Japanese military culture, surrender was the ultimate dishonor. His family would believe him dead, would be told he'd died honorably. The reality that he'd been captured, that he'd chosen survival over death, was a weight he carried every waking moment. From Saipan, he'd been shipped to Hawaii, then to the mainland United States, processed through Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, and eventually assigned to one of the dozens of POW work camps scattered across the rural Midwest. The Moorhead camp was small, just 44 prisoners, housed at a converted farm facility near the town, assigned to help local farmers with the critical labor shortage. America was fighting a war on 2 fronts. Every able-bodied man was either in uniform or in a factory. The farms, essential for feeding both civilians and the military, were desperate for workers. German and Italian POWs had been used for agricultural work since 1943. Japanese prisoners, considered more dangerous and requiring stricter security, had only begun farm work assignments in 1944, and in much smaller numbers. Hiroshi had arrived in Moorhead in April 1945. It was nothing like Japan. The landscape was impossibly flat, the sky enormous, the cold, even in spring, sharp and unfamiliar. Everything was larger than he'd expected. The fields, the machinery, the farms themselves, and the people, these tall, broad-shouldered Norwegian and German farmers who spoke English with strange accents and looked at Japanese prisoners with expressions Hiroshi couldn't quite read. Not hatred exactly, more like wariness, mixed with curiosity. He'd expected to be treated as an enemy. Instead, he'd been put to work thinning sugar beets. The spring of 1945 was a peculiar moment in American history, a time when victory seemed certain, but not yet achieved, when the home front was simultaneously exhausted and energized, when the nation was processing 4 years of total war while trying to imagine what peace might look like. In the Pacific, American forces were closing in on Japan itself. Iwo Jima had fallen in March after 36 days of brutal fighting. Okinawa was currently under assault, a battle that would claim over 12,000 American lives and perhaps 100,000 Japanese military and civilian casualties before it ended in June. The question wasn't whether Japan would be defeated, but when and at what cost. On the home front, the economy was booming. Unemployment was virtually non-existent. Women had flooded into factories and offices, taking jobs previously reserved for men. Rationing was in full effect. Sugar, butter, meat, gasoline, all controlled by a complex system of ration books and stamps. Everyone sacrificed. Everyone contributed. Agriculture was both critical and crippled. Minnesota alone needed to produce millions of bushels of wheat, corn, and sugar beets to feed the war effort. But farm labor had been devastated by the draft. In Clay County, Minnesota, where Hiroshi now worked, the situation was desperate. The 1944 harvest had nearly failed due to lack of workers. The 1945 crop, already planted, already growing, would rot in the fields without help. The solution, controversial but necessary, was POW labor. By 1945, there were approximately 425,000 German, Italian, and Japanese prisoners of war held in more than 500 camps across the United States, the largest POW population any nation had ever hosted. Under the Geneva Convention, they could be used for agricultural work, paid a small wage, 80 cents per day in script, and kept under guard, but not abused. The Moorhead Satellite Camp, officially a subunit of the larger camp at Algona, Iowa, housed 44 Japanese prisoners who worked 10-hour days in the sugar beet fields. They were guarded by a rotating detail of 8 Army soldiers, most of them men too old for combat or recovering from injuries. The arrangement was pragmatic. The farmers needed workers. The prisoners needed something to do besides sit in barbed wire compounds going slowly mad. And the government needed to demonstrate that even enemy combatants could be treated humanely under American custody. Sugar beets were crucial to the wartime economy. With sugar imports from the Philippines and other Pacific sources cut off by Japanese occupation, domestic sugar production had become essential. The Red River Valley of Minnesota and North Dakota was prime beet-growing territory. The flat, rich soil and long summer days produced massive yields, but sugar beets required intensive hand labor. They had to be thinned, excess seedlings removed to allow proper spacing. They had to be weeded, and in the fall, they had to be harvested by hand, pulled from the ground, topped, and loaded onto trucks. It was backbreaking work. Hiroshi did it 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, under the watch of guards, who gradually grew less vigilant as they realized these Japanese prisoners had nowhere to go and no interest in escaping into the featureless prairie. The Engstrom farm was 240 acres of sugar beets, wheat, and pasture land, 8 miles northeast of Moorhead. It had been in the family for 3 generations. Norwegian immigrants who'd claimed the land in 1883 built it into a prosperous operation through decades of brutal labor and careful management. John Engstrom was 56 years old in 1945, a widower with 2 daughters and a son in the Army Air Corps somewhere in England. He was a practical man, tall, silent, economical, with both words and gestures. He'd lost his wife to cancer in 1942, his son to the war effort in 1943, and nearly lost his farm in 1944 when he couldn't find enough workers to harvest his beets. When the government offered him Japanese POW labor for the 1945 season, he'd accepted without hesitation. He wasn't happy about it. His son was flying missions over Germany. His neighbors had sons who'd died in the Pacific. The idea of paying enemy soldiers to work his land felt wrong in ways he couldn't quite articulate. But the alternative was bankruptcy and a failed crop. So he'd signed the papers, paid the government the required fees, and prepared himself to supervise enemy prisoners. Hiroshi was assigned to the Engstrom farm with 6 other prisoners in early May. They worked the beet fields in teams, moving down the rows with short-handled hoes, thinning the seedlings to proper spacing, 12 inches apart exactly. It required precision and stamina. The work was monotonous, but not easy. The sun was relentless, the soil stuck to everything, and the rows seemed to stretch forever. John Engstrom watched them work with a critical eye, saying little, correcting errors with curt gestures. The prisoners understood quickly. He demanded quality work and would accept nothing less. But he also treated them fairly, ensured they had water breaks, adequate tools, shade during the hottest part of the day. It was his younger daughter, Anna, who changed everything. Anna Engstrom was 19 years old, a nursing student home for the summer, helping her father manage the farm, while her older sister taught school in Fargo. She was practical like her father, blonde like her mother had been, with the kind of straightforward confidence that came from growing up on a working farm. She'd been wary of the Japanese prisoners at first. Her brother's letters from England were full of stories about the war, about friends who'd died, about missions over enemy territory. The idea that enemy soldiers were now working their family land felt surreal. But she'd also been raised to treat workers fairly. And watching these men labor in the fields, exhausted, compliant, going about their work with quiet efficiency, she couldn't reconcile them with the propaganda posters of savage Japanese soldiers that plastered every public building. The first time she spoke to Hiroshi was an accident. It was late May, nearly 3 weeks into the work assignment. She'd brought water to the fields in the afternoon, a large thermos and tin cups on a wooden tray. The guards allowed this. The prisoners needed hydration to maintain productivity. She moved down the row, offering water to each man. They took it with small bows, careful not to make eye contact, murmuring, "Thank you," in accented English. When she reached Hiroshi, he was examining a sugar beet seedling with unusual attention. Not working, just looking at it, turning it gently in his fingers. "Is something wrong with it?" she asked. He looked up, startled. "No, is beautiful, structure, perfect." His English was basic but clear. She'd expected broken fragments, grunts, incomprehension. Instead, there was communication. "You're interested in plants?" He hesitated, clearly searching for words. Not plants, engineering, how things built. This. He held up the seedling. "This is building, cell by cell, like bridge, but alive." She stared at him. "You're an engineer?" "Was engineer. Before war. Now prisoner." He set the seedling down carefully and returned to work, as if regretting the conversation. But Anna didn't walk away. What kind of engineering? Construction, building, bridge, road building. He kept working as he spoke, hands moving automatically. I study technical school. Want to build in Osaka. Many tall building, modern. Then war. And now you're thinning sugar beets in Minnesota. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw something other than deference or exhaustion in his eyes. Something that might have been irony or sadness. Yes, now I am farmer. She offered him water. He took it with a small bow, drank, returned the cup. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, she replied. It was the smallest of exchanges, 4 sentences, less than 2 minutes. But it was the moment when Hiroshi Tanaka stopped being a Japanese prisoner and became that engineer who's working the North Field. Over the next 4 weeks, as the sugar beets grew and the summer heat intensified, something unexpected happened on the Engstrom farm. The prisoners became familiar. Not friends. The cultural and linguistic barriers were too substantial, the context too fraught. But familiar. John Engstrom learned which prisoners were fastest workers, which needed more supervision, which could be trusted with complex tasks. The guards relaxed incrementally, spending more time in the shade than actively patrolling, and Anna, despite herself, kept talking to Hiroshi. It started with practical conversations about the work. She'd bring water or tools, and he'd ask questions. Why did sugar beets need exactly 12 inches of spacing? What happened to the beets after harvest? How did the sugar extraction process work? His curiosity was genuine and infectious. He wanted to understand the engineering of agriculture, the systems, the logistics, the problem-solving required to transform raw crops into consumable products. She found herself explaining things she'd taken for granted her entire life. The rotation of crops to preserve soil nutrients, the cooperative structure that allowed small farms to share expensive machinery, the railway system that transported beets to processing plants in Moorhead and Crookston. In return, he told her small things about Japan, about Osaka's rivers and bridges, about technical school, about his family's textile business, his father's pride in quality fabric, his mother's insistence on education, his older brother who was supposed to inherit the business, while Hiroshi built buildings. He never mentioned combat, never discussed how he'd been captured, never offered opinions on the war. Those topics were too dangerous, too loaded with implications and obligations. But he did mention once that his family believed him dead, that there would be no letters, no communication, no way to tell them he was alive and working on a farm in a place called Minnesota that he'd never heard of before the war. They think you died in battle? Anna asked. Is better. To die in battle is honor, to be captured. He shook his head. There is no word in English. Shame is close, but not enough. That seems cruel. Is culture, is expectation. He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, the way he might describe the weather. By late June, a routine had developed. Anna brought water and conversation in the afternoons. Hiroshi worked steadily, answered questions, asked his own. John Engstrom watched this interaction with wary approval. It kept the workers motivated and caused no problems. The guards barely paid attention anymore. Other prisoners noticed and began their own small interactions. One man, a former schoolteacher from Tokyo, helped Anna's father repair a tractor, diagnosed the problem through observation and gestures, guided John through the fix despite speaking perhaps 20 words of English. Another prisoner, skilled with his hands, carved small wooden figures during rest breaks and gave them to the guards' children when they visited the farm. The war continued. News came in fragments. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, letters from soldiers overseas. Germany had surrendered in May. The Pacific War ground on. Everyone knew Japan would eventually fall, but no one knew when or at what cost. The prisoners knew too. They listened to news when guards allowed it, processing information with unreadable expressions. Hiroshi never discussed what he thought about the war's direction, but Anna noticed he'd stopped working with quite the same mechanical efficiency. He'd pause more often, stare at the horizon, seem to be calculating something in his head. Then came the morning of July 9th, 1945, and everything changed. July 9th, 1945. 5:15 in the morning. Hiroshi had been awake for hours. The air was heavy, humid in a way that felt wrong for Minnesota, sticky and oppressive. The sky a strange yellow-gray that promised violence. He'd grown up near water. Osaka was a river city, crisscrossed by canals and waterways. He'd learned to read weather, to sense when flooding was coming. The signs were unmistakable. The pressure drop, the stillness, the peculiar color of the sky. The Red River was already high. Everyone knew this. The spring had been wet, unusually so. The river that divided Minnesota and North Dakota had been running fast and high for weeks. But it was July now. The danger should have passed. Except Hiroshi had been watching the weather with an engineer's eye. He'd been watching the fields, the drainage ditches, the slope of the land. And 3 days ago, when massive thunderstorms had rolled through North Dakota, he'd started calculating. Water volume, soil saturation, drainage capacity, river flow rates. The numbers didn't work. He'd tried to mention it to one of the guards, a young corporal from Michigan who sometimes chatted with the prisoners during breaks. But his English wasn't good enough to explain what he meant. River dangerous sounded like casual observation, not urgent warning. He'd tried to tell John Engstrom, but the farmer had dismissed it with a wave. River's always high in spring. It'll be fine. But Hiroshi knew it wouldn't be fine. He'd spent 3 years building structures designed to withstand water pressure, constructing airstrip drainage systems, calculating flow rates. He knew when water was going to go where it shouldn't. The Red River was going to flood. Not in a week, not gradually, soon, maybe today. And Moorhead, the town where 9,000 people lived, where the processing plants and railways were located, where the economic heart of the region operated, was going to flood badly. At 6 a.m., during the morning assembly before work began, he tried again. He approached the sergeant in charge of the guard detail, a tired-looking man in his 40s who'd been wounded in France and shipped home to finish his service in relative safety. "Sergeant, please. River is danger. Need to warning town." The sergeant looked at him with the particular exhaustion of a man who'd dealt with too many prisoner requests for too many months. "The river's fine, Tanaka. It's high every year." "No, not same. I calculate. Water coming. Big water. Flood." "You calculated." The sergeant's tone made it clear what he thought of a Japanese prisoner's calculations. "Son, I appreciate the concern, but I think the people who've lived here their whole lives know their own river better than you do." Hiroshi felt the familiar weight of helplessness. He had critical information. He had expertise, real, trained expertise. But he was a prisoner, an enemy. His knowledge had no authority. He made a decision that could have resulted in punishment, solitary confinement, or worse. He would write a letter, an unauthorized communication, a violation of POW regulations that could be classified as attempted espionage or communication with the enemy population. He would warn Moorhead, and he would accept the consequences. Hiroshi had paper. The prisoners were allowed to write monitored letters to the Red Cross, carefully censored. He had a pencil. He had basic English, supplemented by a pocket dictionary one of the guards had lent him weeks ago. What he didn't have was authority, credibility, or any reasonable expectation that anyone would listen. He sat in the barn that served as their quarters during the 30-minute lunch break and composed the most important document he'd ever written. To the people of Moorhead, Minnesota, my name is Hiroshi Tanaka. I am Japanese prisoner of war, working on farm near your town. I must tell you important information. Please forgive my English. I was engineer in Japan. I built structures near water for 3 years. I understand how water moves, how much pressure soil can hold, how drainage works. I have been watching your Red River for 2 months. I have been watching the rain, the fields, the water level. I have calculated the numbers. Your river is going to flood very soon. Maybe today. Maybe tomorrow. The water is too high. The ground is too wet. More rain is coming from west. When that rain reaches the river, the water will rise very fast. It will go over the banks. It will flood low areas of your town. I know you do not know me. I know I am your enemy. But I am also an engineer, and I know water. Please check the river level. Please prepare for flood. Please warn people in low areas. I am sorry I cannot explain better in English. I am sorry I am prisoner, and you may not believe me. But please check. Please prepare. It is better to prepare and be wrong than to not prepare and be right. Respectfully, Hiroshi Tanaka, prisoner of war, Camp Moorhead, July 9, 1945. He read it 3 times, checking every word against the dictionary. Then he faced the harder problem: how to deliver it. He couldn't mail it. All prisoner correspondence went through official channels with intense censorship. He couldn't hand it to a guard. They'd confiscate it immediately, and he'd face punishment. He couldn't leave the farm without permission, but he could give it to Anna. She came at 2 p.m. with water, as she did every afternoon. He waited until she reached him, working the row closest to the road, farthest from the guard's supervision. Miss Engstrom, I must ask favor, very important. She noticed immediately that something was wrong. His usual careful politeness had an edge of urgency. What is it? He handed her the folded paper, hidden in his palm, as he took a cup of water. Please read. Please take to town, to police, to mayor, to newspaper. Someone who will listen. Is very important. River will flood, soon. She took the paper, confused. Flood? Hiroshi, the river's fine. No, not fine. I know water. I was engineer. I study 3 years how water moves. River will flood. Please, take letter. Ask them to check river. Please. She looked at the paper, then at him. Saw something in his expression that made her take him seriously. If I do this, you'll get in trouble. This is unauthorized communication. Yes, I know, I accept. But if flood comes, and I say nothing, people die. I cannot say nothing. Anna Engstrom was 19 years old, raised on practical Lutheran values, taught to be skeptical of drama and emotional appeals. But she was also smart enough to recognize expertise when she saw it, and honest enough to admit when someone knew something she didn't. I'll take it to the county engineer's office. They can check the river. But Hiroshi, if you're wrong. If I am wrong, I am punished for breaking rule. If I am right and say nothing, I am coward. Better to be punished than coward. She pocketed the letter and walked back toward the farmhouse without another word. By 4 p.m., the letter was on the desk of Martin Helgeson, Clay County's chief engineer, a man who'd spent 30 years managing drainage projects and flood control systems in the Red River Valley. By 5 p.m., Helgeson was at the river with a survey crew, taking measurements and comparing them to historical flood data. By 6 p.m., he was on the phone with the mayor of Moorhead, saying words that would save the town. We need to evacuate the low-lying areas. Tonight, we're looking at the worst flood since 1897. The flood came at 2:30 a.m. on July 10, 1945. The Red River, swollen by 3 days of heavy rain upstream, rose 5 feet in 2 hours. A surge of water that overwhelmed drainage systems and poured into the streets of downtown Moorhead. But the town was ready. Emergency services had spent the evening moving vulnerable residents to higher ground. Sandbags had been filled and placed at critical points. Businesses had moved inventory to upper floors. The processing plants had shut down and secured their equipment. When the water came, it still caused damage. Flooded basements, swamped streets, closed roads. But not one person died. Not one building was destroyed. The economic damage, while significant, was manageable. Because they'd had warning. Because they'd prepared. Because a Japanese prisoner of war who'd been trained as an engineer had risked punishment to send an unauthorized letter. The story reached the newspapers within days. Japanese POW warns town of flood, read the headline in the Moorhead Daily News on July 12th. The article was respectful, factual, and included a quote from County Engineer Helgeson. Mr. Tanaka's calculations were more accurate than our own initial assessments. His warning gave us the time we needed to prepare. We are grateful. Hiroshi was not punished. The camp commander, reviewing the incident, determined that Tanaka had acted to prevent loss of life and had violated protocol for humanitarian reasons. No disciplinary action was taken. What happened instead was stranger and more profound. On July 15th, the mayor of Moorhead, accompanied by County Engineer Helgeson and a reporter from the newspaper, visited the Engstrom farm. They asked to speak with Hiroshi Tanaka. He was brought from the fields, confused and wary, expecting delayed punishment. Instead, the mayor shook his hand. Mr. Tanaka, on behalf of the citizens of Moorhead, I want to thank you. Your warning saved lives and prevented catastrophic damage to our community. We are in your debt. Hiroshi, who understood perhaps half the words, bowed deeply and said the only thing that made sense. I am engineer. I know water. I could not stay silent. The newspaper photograph from that day shows 5 men standing at the edge of a sugar beet field. The mayor, the engineer, the reporter, a Japanese POW in denim overalls, and John Engstrom, Anna's father, looking almost proud. The article that ran the next day was circulated nationally. Enemy POW saves American town became a minor human interest story, reprinted in dozens of newspapers from Minnesota to California. It was the kind of story Americans wanted in July 1945. Evidence that even in war, humanity persisted. The war ended 6 weeks later. Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. Hiroshi Tanaka remained in American custody until March 1946, when Japanese POWs were finally repatriated. He spent his last months in the United States finishing the sugar beet harvest, working through the fall and winter on the Engstrom farm. By then, things had changed. Guards barely supervised. Prisoners ate meals in the farmhouse sometimes. John Engstrom taught Hiroshi basic Norwegian phrases as a joke. Anna continued her nursing studies but came home on weekends, and she and Hiroshi maintained their afternoon conversations about engineering, agriculture, and the strangeness of being young during wartime. When he left Minnesota in March 1946, Anna gave him a letter. "For your family," she said, "so they know where you were, so they know you're alive." Hiroshi returned to Japan to find Osaka devastated by firebombing. His parents' business was destroyed. His father had died in 1944. His mother and brother had survived, living in a refugee camp outside the city. When he found them, He gave them Anna's letter. They learned he'd been captured, had worked on a farm, had saved a town from flooding. The shame of capture was still real, but it was tempered by the knowledge that he'd acted honorably, within impossible circumstances. He never rebuilt buildings or bridges. Post-war Japan needed everything rebuilt, but Hiroshi found he'd lost his taste for engineering. Instead, he became a teacher, technical instructor at a vocational school in Osaka, teaching young men mathematics and structural principles. He married in 1951, had 3 children, lived quietly, never discussing the war except in the most general terms. He kept one photograph his entire life, the newspaper photo from July 15, 1945, showing him standing in a Minnesota sugar beet field, shaking hands with the mayor of a town he'd saved. Anna Engstrom became a nurse, worked at hospitals in Fargo and Minneapolis, never married. She kept her own copy of that photograph, along with the letters Hiroshi sent from Japan in the 1950s. Brief, formal updates about his life, written in careful English that had improved significantly. They never saw each other again. The distance was too great, the context too complicated. But they remained connected by that summer in 1945, when war and circumstance had brought together a Japanese engineer and a Minnesota farm family, and when expertise had been valued over nationality. The town of Moorhead never formally recognized Hiroshi's warning. No plaque was erected, no street named in his honor. But the older residents remembered. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the flood that didn't destroy the town, the Moorhead Historical Society published a retrospective. Hiroshi Tanaka's story was included, respectfully told, with his photograph and quotes from Anna Engstrom, then 70 years old and still living in Fargo. "He saved us because he was trained to see what others missed," she said in the interview. "He wasn't a hero. He was an engineer who understood water. But he chose to help us even though we were his enemies. That's the part I never forgot." Hiroshi Tanaka died in Osaka in 2003, at age 85. His obituary in the Japanese newspaper mentioned his career as a teacher, his 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and, in a single line near the end, that he had served in the Imperial Navy during the war and had been held as a prisoner of war in the United States. It did not mention sugar beets or Minnesota or the town he saved, but his youngest grandson, going through papers after the funeral, found the photograph, a yellowed newspaper clipping from July 15, 1945. 5 men in a field, his grandfather young, thin, wearing oversized overalls, shaking hands with an American mayor.